A wrong delivery from the poor girl forced the cold CEO millionaire to reveal a forged inheritance. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to our main character. Emily Parker had never been a stranger to mistakes. In fact, her life had been full of them, but none as monumental as the one she was about to make today. The delivery was simple enough, a small package for a man she had never met, a man whose name was etched in every newspaper headline across the country. Charles Hamilton, the millionaire CEO of a global tech empire. To her, he was just another address, another errand to run. But fate had other plans. She arrived at his sleek, glass-fronted office building, feeling the usual nerves creep in. She wasn't used to this kind of place. Her job as a delivery driver was far from glamorous. She wasn't someone who fit in with the polished, high-powered world of billionaires. Still, she had a job to do. Emily rang the bell at the front desk, her hands trembling slightly as she held the package. Yes. The receptionist looked up, her expression unimpressed. Package for Mr. Hamilton, Emily said, her voice a little more shaky than she intended. The receptionist nodded, taking the package without a word, and disappearing into the back. Emily was about to leave when she noticed a tall figure entering the lobby. Charles Hamilton. He was just as imposing as the headlines made him out to be, cold, calculating, and powerful. His sharp suit, flawless appearance, and confident stride were the very image of a man who had everything in the world. But something about his presence made Emily's stomach churn. She quickly turned her gaze to the floor, not daring to make eye contact. "Excuse me." A voice interrupted her thoughts. It was Charles. He was staring at her, his eyes cold and unreadable. "Did you deliver the package?" Emily nodded, her nerves skyrocketing. "Yes, sir. He cut her off, with a wave of his hand. "Very well," he said, and she saw him walk past her toward the elevator. She had done her job. She was about to leave when the receptionist returned, holding a large envelope in her hand. "The CEO is requesting your presence in his office." Now, Emily's heart raced in her chest. What could this possibly be about? She had just done her job, delivered the package. She followed the receptionist to the elevator, feeling the tension build as they rode up to the top floor. The elevator doors opened, revealing a massive office with sweeping views of the city. Charles stood by his desk, his back to her, staring out of the floor-to-ceiling windows. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but this delivery was wrong," he said, turning to face her. "That package, it didn't belong here." Emily was confused. "But I delivered it to the right address." The paperwork said. He threw the package on the desk. "This isn't just any ordinary delivery. This is important, and you've just made a huge mistake." Emily felt a chill run down her spine. What was in the package? Why was it so important? And why was he acting so cold and distant? Before she could say anything, Charles turned his attention to the large envelope the receptionist had brought in. He opened it, revealing a stack of papers, and then froze. His face turned pale. "No, this can't be," he muttered to himself. Emily could see the panic beginning to take hold of him. Something she had never imagined could shake the unshakable CEO. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Charles didn't answer. Instead, he threw the papers back on the desk, his hands shaking. This changes everything." Charles stood frozen for a moment, his mind racing. Emily, still standing by the door, watched him carefully. She had never seen a man like him this unsettled before. He was always so composed, so in control. Yet now, in front of her, he seemed like a man who had just seen the world around him crumble. The silence between them stretched on for what felt like an eternity, before Charles finally spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "This document, it's not real," he said, his eyes scanning the papers in front of him again, as if hoping they would somehow change. Emily took a step closer, her heart pounding in her chest. "What do you mean it's not real?" she asked cautiously. Charles looked up at her, his gaze sharp and intense. "I mean that this so-called inheritance, everything I've built my life around, could be a lie." Emily was taken aback. She had no idea what was going on, but one thing was clear. This was far bigger than just a simple delivery mistake. Charles ran his hand through his hair in frustration, then pointed to the envelope with the documents. These papers were supposed to confirm my inheritance, but they don't. They've been forged. I'm not the heir to the Hamilton estate, not the way I thought I was. Emily blinked, trying to process what he was saying. Wait, you're telling me your entire fortune, it's built on a lie? Charles nodded, the weight of his words sinking in. Yes, everything. The company I run, the assets, the power, it's all tied to this inheritance. And now it's all in jeopardy. He leaned against his desk, running his fingers over the edge as if trying to steady himself. Someone's been pulling the strings behind my back for years, manipulating everything. And I've been too blind to see it. Emily could feel the tension in the room. This wasn't just about a simple mistake anymore. She had accidentally stepped into a web of lies, deception, and betrayal that had been spun for years. She had no idea how deep this went, but it was clear that Charles was about to lose everything he had worked for. So what happens now? Emily asked, her voice soft, yet filled with concern. Charles didn't answer immediately. Instead, he paced back and forth, the lines of stress etched deeply on his face. I don't know, he said finally. I have to figure out who did this and why. But I can't do it alone. I need someone who's not tied to this mess, someone who can help me dig into this without raising suspicion. Emily felt a strange mixture of fear and curiosity flood through her. She had never imagined she would be part of something like this, especially not with someone like Charles. But there was no denying that she felt a pull toward helping him. Something about the way he spoke, his vulnerability, the crack in his usually cold demeanor, made her want to help him. Find the truth. I'll help you, Emily said, surprising even herself. Charles stopped pacing and turned to look at her, his eyes narrowing as if assessing her sincerity. Why, he asked. Why would you help me? You don't even know me. Emily shrugged, a small, uncertain smile crossing her face. Maybe because you're not the man I thought you were. Maybe because everyone deserves the chance to know the truth, even if they're the ones who've been deceived. There was a long pause, but then Charles nodded, a slow, reluctant acknowledgement of her words. All right, he said, his voice steadying. We'll do this together. But we need to move quickly. Whoever did this won't just let us dig into their secrets. They'll do whatever it takes to protect their lie. Emily nodded, her resolve strengthening. She didn't know what she was getting herself into, but she knew one thing for sure. This was far from over, and whatever happened next would change both of their lives forever. Charles sat back in his chair, staring at the documents in front of him, his mind racing. The quiet hum of the city outside his office seemed to fade away, drowned out by the storm of thoughts swirling inside his head. He had never imagined that his life could be built on such a fragile foundation, a lie that could crumble with a single push. He glanced at Emily, who stood across from him, still processing everything he had just told her. She had been so quick to offer her help, and while part of him was grateful, another part of him was still unsure. She was just a delivery girl, after all. She wasn't part of his world. Are you sure you want to get involved in this? Charles asked, his voice betraying a hint of doubt. Emily looked him square in the eye. I'm sure, she said, her voice steady. I may not know your world, but I know what it's like to be lied to. And no one deserves to be deceived, especially not you. Charles studied her for a moment, his mind shifting between skepticism and something else he couldn't quite place. It wasn't just gratitude. It was the first hint of something softer, something he hadn't felt in years. All right, he said, his tone finally softening. But this is going to be dangerous. Whoever did this won't let us dig into their secrets without a fight. Emily nodded, her determination unwavering. I can handle it. Let's just figure out who's behind all of this. The two of them fell into a quiet rhythm, working together to trace the origins of the forged inheritance. Emily had always been resourceful, and though she didn't have the vast resources that Charles did, she knew how to use what she had. She dug through records, researched old contacts, and asked questions no one else dared to ask. She knew there was something hidden beneath the surface, something that tied everything together. Charles, on the other hand, was focused, but in a way that was different from before. He had always been a man of action, of quick decisions and calculated moves. But now, there was a hesitation in his step, a wariness in his eyes. For the first time in years, he didn't have all the answers. They spent days following leads, piecing together bits of information like fragments of a broken puzzle. But with each piece they uncovered, the web of lies seemed to grow more tangled, more complicated. They found evidence of secret meetings, financial transactions that didn't add up, and people who had vanished without a trace. Emily's instincts told her they were getting closer, but Charles wasn't so sure. Maybe we're going about this the wrong way, he said one evening as they sat in his office, reviewing the files. Maybe we should just let it go? Whoever's behind this, they've clearly covered their tracks well enough. Emily shook her head. No, we're not letting it go. You deserve to know the truth. We both do. Charles looked at her, his expression unreadable. He didn't say anything at first, but then, almost reluctantly, he nodded. All right, we'll keep going. But as the days passed, the pressure mounted. They started to feel like they were being watched, the feeling creeping into every conversation, every step they took. It was subtle at first, just a glance here, a shadow there. But it was enough to make Charles uneasy. I think we've stirred up something we can't control, he said, one night as they were leaving his office. Emily, still full of energy, didn't seem to notice the change in his demeanor. We're getting closer. I can feel it, she replied. Charles wasn't so sure. His world of power and control was slipping away from him, and he had no idea who to trust anymore. His thoughts were interrupted when his phone rang. He glanced at the screen, his expression immediately hardening. It was an unknown number. Hello, he answered, his voice sharp. There was a pause on the other end, and then a voice he recognized, though it had been years since he'd heard it. Charles, it's time to stop looking for the truth, the voice said, calm and cold. Some things are better left buried. The words sent a chill down Charles's spine. He knew immediately that they had crossed a line, that whoever was behind this had taken notice of their investigation. Who is this? He demanded, his hand tightening around the phone. You know who I am, the voice replied, with a faint laugh. But if you want to keep your company, your reputation, and your life, you'll stop digging. Now, the call ended abruptly, leaving Charles standing there, frozen. Emily, who had been watching him closely, stepped forward. What happened? She asked, her voice full of concern. Charles's face had turned pale, his mind reeling from the threat he had just received. We've made a mistake, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. They know we're onto them. Charles stared at the phone in his hand, his grip tightening around it, as the voice on the other end faded into silence. The weight of the threat hung heavily in the air, suffocating the room. Emily, who had been standing silently by his side, was the first to break the silence. Charles, she said softly, her voice full of concern, what's going on? Who was that? Charles slowly lowered the phone, his eyes distant as he tried to process the call. He had dealt with threats before, but never like this. Whoever was behind this wasn't playing games. They know we're onto them, he said, his voice laced with a tension he could barely hide. They want us to stop. And if we don't, I don't know what will happen. Emily's heart raced as she took a step closer to him. She had never seen him like this before, vulnerable, uncertain. It was as if the very foundation of his world was cracking beneath him, and he didn't know how to stop it. So what do we do now? She asked, trying to sound calm, though her mind was racing just as fast as his. Charles stood up from his desk and began pacing, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. We have to keep going, but we need to be smart. Whoever's behind this, he stopped mid-sentence, his eyes narrowing. They're powerful, and they're watching us. We can't just blindly charge ahead. We need to find a way to catch them in the act. Emily nodded, a sense of urgency building within her. I agree, but how do we do that? We don't even know who they are. Charles let out a frustrated sigh, running a hand through his hair. That's the problem. We've been chasing shadows. But we have one thing they don't, each other. He turned to face her, his expression hardening with newfound resolve. We work together. We can't do this alone. Emily didn't hesitate. I'm in, she said firmly. But what's the plan? Charles looked at her for a long moment before answering. We go back to the beginning. Whoever forged those documents, whoever's been pulling the strings, they must have left some trace behind. Some mistake, some slip-up that will give us the answer we need. Emily agreed, her mind already beginning to form a plan of action. All right, I'll start looking into the people involved in the company's finances. Maybe we can find something unusual there. Charles nodded, a small spark of hope flickering in his eyes. "I'll dig into the legal side, contracts, documents, any loopholes that might have been exploited. Whoever did this won't have been as careful as they think." The two of them spent the next few hours in the office, scanning through papers, making phone calls, and cross-referencing every lead they could find. Time seemed to fly by in a blur as they worked, each new discovery pulling them deeper into the web of lies and deceit that had been carefully woven around Charles's life. But despite their best efforts, they still couldn't find any concrete answers. Everything was a dead end, or worse, a deliberate distraction. Just as Emily was starting to feel the weight of frustration settle in, her phone buzzed. She picked it up, glancing at the screen. It was a message from an anonymous number. She opened it, her eyes scanning the text quickly. "I know what you're looking for, but if you want to find it, you'll need to come to the old warehouse on North 5th Street. Midnight." The message was short and cryptic, but Emily felt a chill run down her spine. She showed the phone to Charles, who immediately stood up, his eyes narrowing. "It's a trap," he said, his voice cold. "They're trying to lure us out. This isn't just a warning anymore." Emily shook her head. "We can't back down now. If they want to stop us, we have to go. We have to find out who's behind this." Charles stared at her, his mind torn. He knew she was right, but the danger was undeniable. This could be the moment that everything changed. Either they'd uncover the truth, or they'd walk into a trap they couldn't escape from. After a long pause, he finally spoke, his voice steady but resolute. "All right, we go. But we do this smart. We're not walking into that warehouse without backup." Emily nodded, understanding the gravity of his words. They both knew that this was it, the point of no return. Whoever was behind this was making their move, and it was up to them to make sure they stayed one step ahead. They gathered what little they had, grabbed their jackets, and left the office together, their steps echoing in the empty hallway. The night air was cool as they made their way to the car, the tension between them palpable. Emily could feel the weight of what they were about to do pressing down on her. This was bigger than she had ever imagined, and yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the verge of something even darker than they had realized. Charles started the engine, and they pulled out of the parking lot, heading toward North 5th Street. As the city lights flickered in the rearview mirror, neither of them spoke. They both knew that when they reached that warehouse, they would be stepping into a world of danger, deception, and secrets that had been buried for far too long. The drive to North 5th Street felt like it took an eternity. The dim streetlights flashed by, casting long shadows across the narrow, empty roads. Emily's heart raced, the weight of what they were about to do pressing down on her chest. Charles sat beside her, his jaw clenched, eyes fixed on the road ahead. The silence between them was thick, the kind that comes when two people are on the verge of stepping into something they cannot undo. As they neared the warehouse, the landscape around them shifted. The glitzy city lights faded into the background, replaced by industrial buildings, dark alleys, and the sense that they were being drawn into a place where no one wanted to go. The warehouse loomed ahead, its windows dark, its steel doors creaking in the wind. Charles slowed the car, pulling up to the curb a block away. He turned off the engine and looked over at Emily. "We're not just walking in there blindly," he said, his voice low and firm. "We're going to keep our distance, observe first. If anything feels off, we leave. No hesitation." Emily nodded, her hands gripping the seat. "I understand. But we can't turn back now, can we?" Charles didn't answer immediately. He just stared at the warehouse for a moment longer, as if weighing the risks, before finally speaking. "No, we can't." They stepped out of the car, the cool night air hitting them like a wall. The streets were eerily quiet, the only sound coming from the occasional distant car. They moved quickly but cautiously, staying close to the shadows as they made their way to the warehouse. The building looked abandoned, its metal exterior battered by time and neglect. The air around them felt heavy, thick with the promise of something dark just beyond the edge of their vision. As they approached the entrance, Emily's nerves kicked into high gear. She had no idea what they were walking into. They stopped just outside the door, both of them listening intently. The faintest sound, footsteps, echoed from inside. Charles raised his hand, signaling for Emily to stay quiet. They waited, their breath shallow, their eyes scanning every corner of the area. The door creaked open slightly, revealing a sliver of dim light spilling from the interior. Charles motioned for Emily to stay back as he peered through the crack. What he saw made his stomach drop. Inside, there were figures, shadowy, indistinct. The air smelled stale, like the building hadn't been used in years. But the figures were moving, and that was enough to tell him they weren't alone. After a few tense moments, Charles gestured for Emily to follow him around to the side of the building, away from the door. They crouched low, trying to stay out of sight. "They're in there," he whispered. "But I don't know who they are." Emily swallowed hard, her throat dry. "Do you think this is the end of the line?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Charles didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled out his phone, sending a quick message. He was contacting his trusted security team. He'd need backup. If things went south, he wouldn't risk them both being caught in the middle of this. Minutes passed like hours, the tension in the air growing with every second. Emily's mind raced. Who were these people? Why were they willing to go to such lengths to stop them? What was the truth they were hiding? The door to the warehouse suddenly slammed shut, the figures inside no longer visible. Charles gestured for Emily to stay down, as he peered through the gaps in the building. His heart pounded in his chest. Something was wrong. The figures inside weren't just doing business, they were waiting for something. Or someone. And now, it felt like they were waiting for them. He could hear the faintest sound of footsteps approaching the back of the building. They were closing in. Emily's breath hitched. "Charles, they know we're here," she said, a sense of panic rising in her chest. Charles turned sharply to her, his expression hardening. "Stay calm. We're not running. We're not leaving until we get answers." As the footsteps grew closer, they both took a deep breath, preparing for whatever was about to come next. The silence that followed felt like the calm before the storm. Then, the unmistakable sound of a door unlocking echoed through the night. The warehouse was about to open. The danger was imminent, and Charles and Emily knew that nothing would ever be the same after tonight. The sound of the door unlocking echoed through the still night, sending a chill through both Emily and Charles. They exchanged a quick glance, both aware that the next moments would determine everything. Charles held his breath, motioning for Emily to stay crouched low against the building's cold, rusted exterior. His mind raced. Every part of him screamed to turn and leave, but he knew they had already come too far to back out now. They had to see this through. Footsteps shuffled from the inside, growing louder as they approached the rear entrance. Charles's heart hammered in his chest. He had never felt so exposed. As the door creaked open, a sliver of light spilled into the alleyway, casting long shadows. Two figures emerged, their faces hidden by the darkness. They moved like shadows themselves, quick, deliberate, and without hesitation. Charles and Emily barely breathed as the figures passed, unaware of the two watching them from behind the building. As the last of them disappeared into the warehouse, Charles motioned for Emily to follow him. They moved quickly, silently, staying close to the wall, their footsteps barely audible against the cold concrete. They reached a small window on the side of the building. Charles crouched down, peering through the grime-covered glass. Inside, he could see figures moving in a tight circle, their voices muffled but urgent. He strained to make out the words, but it was no use. Whoever they were deep in conversation, and it seemed like they were making plans. But plans for what? Emily joined him at the window, her face tense as she too tried to catch a glimpse of what was happening inside. The figures, she noticed, weren't just ordinary people. There was a sense of power in the way they moved, an air of authority that made her stomach twist. These were not the kind of people she had ever imagined Charles being involved with. She had no idea what was going on, but it was clear now that this wasn't just about a forged inheritance anymore. They were in too deep. "We need to get in there," Charles whispered, his voice low but determined. "We have to know who's behind this." Emily nodded, though her heart was pounding in her chest. "How do we get inside?" she asked. "We wait for the right moment," he replied. "Stay close. We'll slip inside when they're distracted." They waited, watching the figures inside the warehouse. The conversation seemed to be growing more heated, but Charles couldn't make out the specifics. His eyes darted around, looking for any sign of an opening, any distraction that would allow them to slip inside unnoticed. It felt like an eternity before the moment finally came. One of the figures stood up, moving toward the back of the warehouse. Charles motioned to Emily. It was now or never. They crept around to the back of the building, staying in the shadows. The door was slightly ajar, just enough for them to slip through. They took a deep breath and moved forward, slipping inside as silently as possible. The air inside the warehouse was thick and stale, smelling of old wood and dust. The space was vast, stretching out into the shadows, and Charles could barely make out the outlines of stacked crates and old machinery. They stayed close to the walls, their footsteps muffled by the worn floorboards beneath them. The voices of the figures were clearer now, and Charles strained to listen, trying to make sense of the conversation. Not just about the inheritance, one of the voices said. We need to secure the future. He's too dangerous now, too unpredictable. Charles felt a pang in his chest. The future? What future were they talking about? And who was he? He had a sinking feeling in his stomach that the answers he was looking for were just out of reach. But Emily's voice broke through his thoughts, urgent and quiet. Charles, look. She pointed to a small table at the far end of the room. There, on the table, were several documents spread out, their edges worn and yellowed. Charles's eyes widened as he recognized one of the papers, the same one that had caused everything to unravel. The forged inheritance document. It was right there, in front of him. His hands clenched into fists. This was it, the final piece. But before he could move forward, he heard a door creak open from across the room. Someone was coming. They had to move fast. Without thinking, Charles grabbed Emily's arm, pulling her toward the nearest shadowed corner. They crouched low, their bodies pressed against the cold concrete, as the footsteps drew nearer. Charles held his breath, his heart racing. Whoever was coming could be the key to everything. The footsteps grew louder, closer. He could feel the tension in the air, as if the very walls of the warehouse were holding their breath too. Then, just as the footsteps reached the corner, they stopped. A voice broke the silence. I know you're here, it said. The chill in the voice sent a shiver down Charles's spine. I think it's time we had a talk. The voice echoed through the dark warehouse, sending a jolt of fear through Charles's body. He froze, not daring to move, his heart pounding in his chest. Emily, beside him, held her breath, her wide eyes locked on him for guidance. Whoever had spoken had seen them. There was no doubt about it. The voice came again, colder this time, as if it already knew they were there. I said, I know you're here. The sound of footsteps approached, slow and deliberate, the heavy thud of boots on the concrete floor drawing nearer. Charles's mind raced, trying to process what was happening. Who had seen them? Was this the end of their search for the truth? His hand instinctively reached for his phone, but he knew there was no time to call for help. He needed to think fast. A shadow appeared in the dim light ahead, moving like a ghost in the dark, its form growing larger with each step. Charles's eyes strained to make out the figure, but the darkness made it impossible to tell who it was. I'm not going to hurt you, the voice said, the tone almost mocking. But I can't let you keep digging into things you don't understand. The figure stepped into the faint light, revealing a tall, lean man with sharp features. His face was familiar to Charles, though he hadn't seen him in years. It was Victor Blackwell, an old business associate of his father. Charles's stomach dropped. He hadn't thought about Victor in a long time, but now, seeing him standing there, it all came rushing back. Victor had always been a shadow in the background, a man of few words but a ruthless streak when it came to business. He was the kind of person who made deals in the dark, hidden away from the public eye. But why was he involved in this? Why was he here now, stopping Charles from uncovering the truth? Victor, Charles said, his voice low and steady, trying to mask the shock that ran through him. What's going on? Why are you part of this? Victor's lips curled into a small, knowing smile, but his eyes were cold. You've been digging into things you shouldn't, Charles, he said, his voice laced with a dangerous calm. Your father's legacy is complicated. It's never been as simple as you think it is. Charles felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He had always known there were things about his father's business that didn't add up, but he had never expected to hear this. What do you mean? He asked, his voice tightening with suspicion. What are you hiding? Victor's smile faded, replaced by an almost pitying look. It's not about hiding, Charles. It's about protecting what's yours. What you don't understand is that there are forces at play here that you can't control. You've been living in a world of illusion. The words hit Charles like a punch to the gut. You're telling me my entire inheritance is built on lies? He asked, disbelief and anger rising in his chest. Victor didn't flinch. Your father made some deals, Charles. Deals that were never meant to be public. He secured your future in ways that would make your head spin. But those deals come with a price. Charles clenched his fists, fighting the wave of frustration and confusion threatening to overwhelm him. What price? He demanded. Victor's eyes flicked to Emily, who had been silently observing the exchange. She was tense, her body language unreadable, but Charles could feel the weight of her concern. The price is that some truths are better left buried, Charles, Victor said, his voice dropping lower. The truth you're after? It's not something you want to find. A cold silence followed his words. Charles's mind raced as he processed what Victor had just revealed. His father, the man who had built the empire he had inherited, had been involved in something far darker than he could have ever imagined. The inheritance wasn't just a gift. It was a result of deals, secrets, and hidden truths that now threatened everything Charles thought he knew. I won't stop, Victor, Charles said, his voice hardening. You don't understand. This isn't just about money. It's about the truth. And I will find it. Victor's eyes narrowed, a flicker of irritation crossing his features. You don't get it, he said, stepping closer. You're playing with fire, Charles. And when it burns, you won't just lose your inheritance. You'll lose everything. Charles stood his ground, his body tense, ready for whatever came next. Emily, still by his side, looked up at him, her expression resolute. We're not backing down, she said, her voice strong. We'll find the truth, no matter what it costs. Victor sighed, as if disappointed. Then you'll both regret it, he said quietly, before turning on his heel and walking away into the shadows of the warehouse. Charles watched him disappear into the darkness, a sense of foreboding settling over him. He had no idea what Victor's words meant, but he knew one thing for sure. The deeper they went, the more dangerous this game became. He wasn't backing down, but he also knew they were now in a fight that could destroy everything. Turning to Emily, he met her eyes. We have to keep going, he said, determination creeping into his voice. The truth is out there, and I'm going to find it. Emily nodded, her resolve unwavering. Together, she said. And with that, they moved deeper into the warehouse, their footsteps echoing through the hollow space, ready to uncover whatever truths waited in the shadows. Charles and Emily moved deeper into the warehouse, their steps slow and deliberate, careful not to make a sound. The air around them was heavy, almost suffocating, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Each corner they turned, each shadow they passed, felt like a step closer to something they weren't prepared for. But neither of them could turn back now, not after everything they had uncovered. The faint murmur of voices echoed through the dark, but Charles and Emily didn't stop. They moved toward the source, trying to stay hidden in the thick shadows. The warehouse was a labyrinth of old crates, rusted machinery, and abandoned remnants of what had once been a place of business. It was clear no one had used it in years, but tonight, it was alive with secrets. As they neared the center of the room, the voices grew louder, clearer. They could make out a few words now, phrases that hinted at a conversation far more complicated than they had imagined. The deal is done, one voice said, cold and clipped. There's nothing they can do now. Charles froze, his heart racing. The voice sounded familiar, too familiar. It was Victor. You think he'll keep quiet? Another voice asked. It was lower, more gravelly, and Charles's gut clenched. He'll have to. No one would believe him anyway. And what about her? The question was sharp, almost accusatory. Charles's mind raced, but he couldn't place who it was. She's a complication, Victor replied, the tone of his voice making it clear he wasn't concerned. But she's already in too deep. It's just a matter of time before she's out of the picture. The words hit Charles like a slap. Emily was a complication? His chest tightened with anger, but he forced himself to stay quiet. They couldn't afford to be discovered now. He motioned for Emily to stay down, and they crouched behind a stack of crates, barely breathing. The voices continued, but now the words didn't matter. What mattered was the danger they were in. Victor wasn't just playing a game. He was willing to do anything to protect his secrets, even if it meant silencing anyone who got in his way. Charles's mind whirled with the implications. What was this all about? What had his father gotten involved in? And why was Victor so determined to stop them? We need to finish this, the gravelly voice said, before they figure out too much. Agreed, Victor replied. Let's wrap it up. No more delays. The conversation fell into silence, but Charles knew they couldn't stay much longer. He glanced at Emily, who was just as tense, her face pale but determined. They had to get out before they were discovered. But just as they began to move, the sound of footsteps echoed from the far side of the room. It was too late. Someone was coming. Charles's eyes darted around, looking for a way out, but there was nowhere to hide. They were trapped. The footsteps grew louder, and Charles's pulse quickened. He could hear the sound of heavy boots on the concrete, each step bringing whoever it was closer to them. Emily's hand gripped his arm, and he could feel her heartbeat match his own. They were running out of time. The footsteps stopped just a few feet away, and Charles held his breath. He wasn't sure what to do, stay hidden or take a risk and make a move. He waited, listening for any clue about what was going on. Then, the voice of a man, deep and calm, cut through the tension. "I know you're here." The words were spoken with such certainty, it sent a cold shiver down Charles's spine. "Come out now, and maybe we'll make this easy for you." Charles's heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't move. Emily's eyes locked on his, her face pale but resolute. She was ready to face whatever came next. Charles exhaled slowly, steeling himself for what was to come. There was no turning back. He wasn't going to run. He wasn't going to hide. The truth was within reach, and nothing, not even Victor and his associates, was going to stop him from finding it. "I'm not hiding," Charles said, his voice steady but filled with determination. Slowly, he stood up, pulling Emily to her feet with him. The figure that had been approaching them stepped into the dim light, revealing a man dressed in black, his face partially obscured by shadows. "You should have stayed away," the man said, his voice laced with menace. Charles squared his shoulders, not backing down. "No, we're here for the truth, and you can't stop us." The man chuckled, a cold, humorless sound. "The truth? You're too late for that. It's already been decided. You're too late to stop what's coming." Charles's jaw clenched. He had no idea what this man meant, but one thing was clear: they had underestimated the danger. They had walked right into the heart of something far bigger than they could have imagined. But it was too late to turn back now. "We'll see about that," Charles said, his voice unwavering. He wasn't going to let Victor or anyone else keep him from the truth. Not now. Not ever. The man stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "Then prepare yourself," he said, "because the game is only just beginning." The man in black took another step forward, his presence almost suffocating in the still air of the warehouse. Charles didn't flinch, though his pulse was racing. He could feel Emily's hand gripping his, her fingers cold with fear, but there was no hesitation in her eyes. They were in this together, and nothing was going to stop them. "You're not going to intimidate me," Charles said, his voice steady, despite the weight of the situation. "We're not backing down. Not now, not ever." The man in black studied him for a moment, as if assessing the situation, before a dark smile tugged at his lips. "You really think you can stop this?" he asked, his voice dripping with disdain. "You've walked into something far beyond your understanding. You have no idea who you're dealing with." Charles's jaw tightened. "I don't care who you are or what you think you can control. I'm here for the truth, and I'm not leaving without it." The man's smile faded, replaced by a look of cold calculation. He stepped back, almost theatrically, as though considering something. "Truth," he repeated, almost as if the word tasted foreign to him. "You're chasing a fantasy, Charles. The truth isn't something you can find so easily. It's not a prize you get to claim. Some things are better left buried." Charles stepped forward, his voice rising with defiance. "No, the truth is what I deserve, and it's what Emily deserves. You can't keep hiding behind lies and deception." Emily's grip on Charles's arm tightened, and she stepped out from behind him, facing the man directly. "We've come too far to turn back now," she said, her voice firm. "We're not scared of you." The man's expression darkened at her words, but instead of moving towards them, he stepped back again, his eyes calculating, almost amused. "You think you're heroes? You're not," he said, his voice like ice. "You're pawns in a much larger game, and you're already too deep in it to turn back. Do you really think you can beat the people who are in control here?" Charles felt a wave of realization wash over him. It wasn't just Victor they were up against. There was something much larger at play, something far more dangerous. He could feel the gravity of the situation sinking in, the weight of what they were up against pressing down on him. But he wasn't about to back off now. "I'm not afraid of the people you're talking about," Charles said, his voice unwavering. I don't care how deep this goes. I'll fight to the end. The man in black nodded slowly, as if Charles's words had confirmed something he already knew. I admire your resolve, he said, almost as if in approval. But I'm afraid it's misplaced. The game is already over for you, Charles. It's too late to change anything now. The finality in his tone hit Charles like a hammer blow, but he refused to let it rattle him. We'll see about that, he said, his voice low but determined. Emily stepped closer to him, standing by his side. She wasn't backing down either. You're not in control here, she said, her eyes steady and strong. We are. The man in black's expression shifted, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. He glanced at the shadows around them, as if he was waiting for something. Charles didn't know what it was, but he could sense it. Something was about to change. The man's hand slowly moved to his jacket pocket, and Charles instinctively tensed, preparing for whatever was to come next. But then just as quickly as it had appeared, the man withdrew his hand and sighed. I'm wasting my time, he muttered to himself. You both are too stubborn to understand. He turned toward the door, his steps echoing in the vast emptiness of the warehouse. Charles and Emily stayed where they were, watching him, waiting. The man paused at the door, his back to them. You've been warned, he said, his voice carrying over his shoulder. The truth you seek? It's not yours to find. It's already been decided, and there's nothing you can do to change it. With those final words, he stepped into the darkness, leaving Charles and Emily standing in the silence that followed. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The weight of the man's words hung heavily in the air, but Charles knew one thing for sure. They couldn't let him win. They couldn't let anyone win. He's wrong, Charles said, finally breaking the silence. We're not giving up. Not now. Emily nodded. We've come this far. We're not stopping until we find the truth. Charles turned toward the dark depths of the warehouse, determination hardening in his chest. Let's go. We're not leaving without answers. With that, they stepped forward into the darkness, ready to face whatever waited for them in the shadows. The game was far from over, and Charles wasn't about to let it end like this. They were going to find the truth, no matter what, and they would stop at nothing to do it. Charles and Emily walked deeper into the darkness, the air thick with the scent of old dust and rust. Their footsteps were the only sound, echoing through the vast warehouse, each step taking them further into the unknown. The man in black had disappeared, leaving only his cryptic words hanging in the air. The truth was already decided. They couldn't change anything. But Charles wasn't ready to accept that. He refused to let this be the end. He's trying to scare us, Emily said, breaking the silence, her voice firm and determined. He's wrong. We can still find the truth. Charles glanced at her, a slight nod of agreement. We can't stop now. We're closer than ever. The words felt like a promise, but they both knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy. They had already uncovered so many lies, but the deeper they went, the more dangerous things became. The stakes were higher now, and Charles felt it in the pit of his stomach. He wasn't sure who they were up against, but he knew they couldn't trust anyone. The man in black was just a shadow, a small piece of a much larger puzzle. But they had no choice but to keep going. They had to find the missing pieces. We need to get to the files, Charles said, his voice low. If we can find those documents, we'll know everything. Everything about the inheritance, about the deals my father made. Emily nodded, her eyes scanning the shadows. Where are they? Charles looked around, trying to get a sense of the layout of the warehouse. It was massive, stretching out in every direction, with piles of old machinery and broken crates scattered everywhere. The place felt like a maze. They must be in the back, he said, moving towards a dark corridor in the distance. The silence was suffocating, and every time their footsteps echoed off the walls, it felt like someone was watching them. But they couldn't afford to hesitate. They had no time to waste. They moved quickly, cautiously, keeping close to the walls and avoiding the open spaces where they might be seen. As they approached the back of the warehouse, they could see a faint light filtering through a crack in the wall. It wasn't much, but it was enough to guide them. Charles's pulse quickened. This was it. They were so close. They reached the door, which was slightly ajar. Charles took a deep breath and pushed it open, stepping into the room beyond. It was a small, cluttered office, dimly lit by a single lamp in the corner. Papers were scattered across a desk, and filing cabinets lined the walls. This was where the truth was hidden. Emily stepped in behind him, her eyes scanning the room. But Charles's focus was already on the desk. He moved quickly, rifling through the papers, looking for anything that could give him the answers he needed. It didn't take long before he found a file marked confidential, the bold letters standing out against the faded paper. He opened it, his heart racing as he flipped through the pages. The documents inside were old, yellowed with age, but they were clear enough to make sense of. His father's signature was at the bottom of every page. Charles's eyes moved quickly across the words, piecing together the story. The deals, the lies, the truths that had been hidden for years. His hands shook as he realized what it all meant. His father hadn't just built an empire. He had done it on the backs of others, manipulating people, forging agreements, and covering up secrets that now threatened to tear everything apart. Charles clenched his fists, frustration and anger surging through him. He had always admired his father, but this was beyond anything he had ever imagined. What is it? Emily's voice broke through his thoughts. He looked up, meeting her gaze. She could see the shock in his eyes. It's worse than I thought, he said, his voice low. Everything I've believed about my father, about this inheritance, it's all a lie. It was built on manipulation and deceit. Emily stepped closer, her expression softening with sympathy. But this is good, Charles. You found the truth. You're not in the dark anymore. Charles shook his head. No, Emily. I've uncovered a part of it. But there's more. There's still so much we don't know. And now that we know, we have to be careful. Whoever is behind this won't just let us walk away. As if on cue, a distant sound broke the silence. The faintest of noises, like footsteps approaching. Charles's heart skipped a beat. Someone's coming, he whispered, his eyes darting around the room. They didn't have much time. Emily's hand gripped his arm, her body tense, ready to move. They needed to hide the documents, but there was nowhere to put them. The only option was to leave the room and hope they weren't caught. Charles quickly shoved the file into his jacket, pressing it against his chest. Let's go, he said, his voice barely a whisper. They moved toward the back door, careful to make as little noise as possible. As they slipped out into the darkness, Charles couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every step felt heavier, every breath more labored. They were running out of time, and they both knew it. But they couldn't stop now. Not when the truth was so close. They would find it, no matter what. They had to. Charles and Emily moved quickly through the warehouse, their footsteps soft but urgent against the cold concrete floor. The documents pressed tightly too. Charles's chest, the weight of them almost suffocating. Every second felt like it could be their last. They had barely made it out of the office, and now, they had to find a way to get out of the warehouse without being caught. The distant sound of footsteps echoed in the halls, and Charles's heart skipped a beat. They couldn't afford to be discovered now. He grabbed Emily's arm, pulling her to a side door that led to a narrow hallway at the back of the building. We need to move fast, he whispered, his voice strained with urgency. We're not safe here. Emily nodded, her eyes wide with fear, but filled with determination. Where do we go now? She asked, her voice low. We get to the front. We leave. We can't stay here any longer. Charles's mind raced as he led the way down the dark hallway, every creak of the floorboards beneath their feet making him tense. He knew they were being hunted, but he also knew that the truth was so close. He could feel it in his bones. They were almost there. They reached the end of the hallway, and Charles carefully peeked around the corner. The front of the warehouse was in sight. No sign of movement, but that didn't mean they were in the clear. Stay behind me, Charles said quietly, motioning for Emily to follow closely. They moved cautiously toward the exit, but just as they were about to reach the door, they heard voices from behind them. They're not getting away, a man's voice growled. Get to the front. Don't let them leave. Panic surged through Charles's chest. They weren't going to make it out. Not this time. But then, Emily did something unexpected. Without a word, she grabbed his hand and pulled him toward a nearby storage closet. The door creaked as they slipped inside, and Emily quickly closed it behind them. The air in the small space was damp and musty, but it was their only chance. We have to stay quiet, Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. They'll be looking for us. We can't let them find us. Charles nodded, his breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. He had no idea how long they would have to hide, but every passing second felt like a lifetime. He could hear the footsteps getting closer. He could hear the voices. The tension in the air was unbearable. But then, the voices stopped. The footsteps faded into the distance. Charles held his breath. Had they passed? Were they safe? For a long moment, everything was still. Emily's grip tightened on his hand, her fingers cold with fear, but they both stayed completely silent, waiting. Time seemed to stretch on, but then, just as suddenly as the silence had fallen, the footsteps started again, closer this time. They were coming back. "We need to move," Charles whispered urgently. He reached for the door, carefully turning the knob and inching it open just a crack. He peeked outside, scanning the hallway for any sign of movement. The coast was clear for now. "Now," he urged, and they slipped out of the closet, moving as silently as possible. They had to make it to the exit. They had to escape. But just as they turned a corner, they found themselves face to face with a figure. The man in black. The same one from before. He was standing in their way, his arms crossed, a smirk playing at the corner of his lips. "You really thought you could get away, didn't you?" he said, his voice dripping with mockery. Charles froze, his hand instinctively reaching for the file still hidden beneath his jacket. "You're not getting away with this," he said, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his insides. The man in black didn't move, his gaze sharp and calculating. "You don't understand," he said quietly. "You're not in control here. You never were." Charles's heart pounded in his chest, but he refused to back down. "I'm in control of my own life," he said. "I'm in control of the truth. And you won't stop me from finding it." The man's smirk faded slightly, his eyes narrowing as if calculating his next move. "You think you have all the answers?" he asked, taking a step forward. "You have no idea what you're really up against. The truth? It's a weapon. And some truths are better left buried." Charles could feel the weight of his words, but he wasn't backing down. "No, we're not going to stop. Not until we find out who's behind all of this." The man's eyes flicked toward Emily, then back to Charles. There was a moment of tense silence before he spoke again. "You're playing a dangerous game, Charles," he said, quietly. "But if you really want the truth, then come with me." The words hit Charles like a punch. He didn't trust this man, not for a second. But at the same time, he knew they had no other choice. "Fine," Charles said, his voice firm. "Lead the way." The man nodded, turning and walking toward a door further down the hall. Charles hesitated for only a moment before following. Whatever this man had in store, whatever game he was playing, Charles and Emily were ready for it. They had come this far, and they weren't going to stop now. They were about to face the truth, no matter what the cost. Charles and Emily followed the man down the narrow hallway, the dim light from the ceiling casting long shadows against the walls. The silence was unnerving, only broken by the sound of their footsteps and the occasional creak of the old floorboards beneath their feet. The man in black moved with purpose, his pace steady, but he didn't speak. Charles felt the tension building in his chest. They were getting closer to the truth, but with each step, the danger felt more real. Emily's grip on his arm was tight, and he could feel her fear, but also her resolve. She wasn't going to let anything stop them. The man finally stopped at a door at the end of the hallway, turning to face them. His expression was unreadable, his eyes cold. "This is it," he said, his voice low, almost devoid of emotion. Charles felt a knot form in his stomach. This wasn't just another door. He could feel it. This was the moment where everything would change. "What's behind this door?" Charles asked, his voice steady despite the nervous energy thrumming through him. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached for the door handle, his fingers lingering on it for a moment, as if weighing something in his mind. Then, he pushed the door open. Inside was a small room, bare except for a single desk in the center, with a few scattered papers on top. There were no windows, and the only light came from a single, flickering bulb overhead. The air was thick with dust, and everything felt frozen in time, as if it had been untouched for years. "Go in," the man said, stepping aside to let them through. Charles hesitated but stepped forward, Emily right behind him. The door clicked shut behind them, sealing them in the small room. Charles's eyes immediately went to the desk, where the papers were scattered. One of them caught his attention, its bold red stamp at the top read "Confidential." His heart raced as he moved closer, reaching for the file. He could feel Emily's presence behind him, her breath shallow as she, too, watched him closely. The man in black stood by the door, his arms crossed, watching them carefully. "You'll find what you're looking for," he said, his tone flat. But be warned, some things are better left unknown. Charles didn't respond. He opened the file, his fingers trembling slightly as he scanned the pages. It didn't take long for the full weight of what he was seeing to hit him. The deals his father had made, the lies that had been spun to keep everything in place, were all there in black and white. The inheritance wasn't just forged. It was a carefully constructed lie that had been built over decades. His father's entire empire, everything Charles had thought was his birthright, had been built on manipulation, deceit, and betrayal. The room seemed to close in around him as he absorbed the gravity of it all. His mind was racing, trying to process the impossible truth. He had spent his entire life believing in the legacy his father had left him, but now he saw it for what it was, a facade, a house of cards ready to collapse. This can't be real, Charles whispered, his voice hoarse with disbelief. He could feel the anger building in his chest, the crushing weight of betrayal pressing down on him. It's real, the man in black said, his voice cold and detached. Everything you've worked for, everything you thought you understood, your father's empire, your inheritance, it's all a lie. The question now is what you're going to do with that knowledge. Charles turned to face him, his eyes filled with a mix of fury and determination. What do you want from me? He demanded. Why are you showing me this? The man's expression didn't change. You're the one who asked for the truth, he said simply. Now you have it. What you choose to do next is up to you. Charles was silent for a moment, the weight of his options pressing down on him. He could walk away, let the lie continue, and take what was left of his father's empire for himself. Or, he could expose the truth, tear it all down, and start from scratch, destroy everything his father had built, but also free himself from the shadow of the man he had thought he knew. I won't let this stand, Charles said finally, his voice filled with resolve. I'll expose everything. The truth is worth more than any empire. Emily stepped forward, her eyes meeting his. We'll do it together, she said softly, her voice steady with conviction. The man in black didn't say a word as he watched them, his expression unchanged. But Charles could feel the tension in the air, as if the man knew what was coming. He had just given them the key to everything, but now it was up to them to unlock the door. You're making a mistake, the man finally said, his tone warning. Some truths don't just change everything, they destroy everything. Charles stood tall, his chest rising with a deep breath. I'm willing to burn it all down, he said, his voice steady. I'll do whatever it takes. The man in black said nothing more. He simply turned and walked toward the door, pausing just before he left the room. You'll regret this, he said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. But by the time the words reached Charles's ears, the door had already closed behind him, leaving them alone in the quiet, dusty room. Charles looked at the file in his hands, the weight of the truth pressing down on him. There was no turning back now. They had chosen their path, and there was no going back from it. Whatever came next, they would face it together. And Charles knew one thing for sure. The truth would be worth whatever it cost. Charles sat in the dimly lit room, the weight of the file heavy in his hands. He could feel the truth pulsing in the pages, the lies laid bare in front of him. The world he had known, the life he had built around the inheritance his father left him, had all been built on deceit. He had been living a lie. Emily sat across from him, her expression as determined as ever, though her eyes held the same storm of emotions that he felt. She knew the stakes. They had come this far, uncovered so many secrets, and now they were standing on the precipice of a new reality. We can't turn back now, Charles said, his voice filled with quiet resolve. He looked up from the papers, meeting Emily's gaze. We've seen the truth. We have to expose it. Emily nodded, her face set with determination. But it's going to be dangerous. We're up against powerful people, people who will stop at nothing to protect the lies they've built. Charles clenched his fists, his fingers digging into the edges of the file. I don't care. We can't let them win. Not after everything we've uncovered. The door to the room creaked open, interrupting the heavy silence. Charles's heart skipped a beat. He instinctively stood, the file still clutched tightly in his hands. The man in black entered the room, his face as cold and unreadable as ever. He looked at them both, his eyes flicking to the file Charles was holding. You've seen it, then, the man said, his voice smooth but carrying an edge of something darker. The truth. Charles didn't flinch. Yes, and we're going to expose it. The man's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. You don't understand what you're dealing with, he said, stepping closer. These people won't let you take down what they've built. They will destroy you first. Emily stood beside Charles, her back straight, her eyes unwavering. Let them try, she said, her voice calm but fierce. We're not backing down. The man in black studied them both for a long moment, then let out a soft, humorless laugh. You think you're in control? You think you can just walk away from this with the truth? It's not that simple. Charles's grip tightened on the file, his mind whirling with everything that had led up to this moment. He had spent years chasing shadows, trusting in the inheritance that he thought was his birthright. But now he knew better. His father's empire wasn't just built on power, it was built on manipulation, on exploiting people, and on burying the truth beneath layers of lies. I don't care how difficult it is, Charles said, his voice steady. I'm going to make sure the truth comes out, no matter what it takes. The man in black studied him, his eyes calculating. You're making a mistake, he said quietly. This is bigger than you think. You think you're fighting for justice, but all you're doing is playing into their hands. They want you to destroy your father's legacy. It's what they've been setting up all along. Charles felt a cold wave of realization wash over him. He had always assumed that the lies had been built by his father's enemies. But now, the man's words made him question everything. What if the ones pulling the strings were the very people who had built the empire in the first place? What if they wanted him to expose the truth, to tear down everything his father had built, just to gain control of it all? Then I'll burn it all down, Charles said, his voice firm, his resolve stronger than ever. If the truth is a weapon, then I'll use it. The man in black shook his head slowly. You don't understand. The moment you expose the truth, you'll destroy everything. Not just the empire, but everyone you care about. They will come after you. Charles stepped forward, standing tall and unwavering. I don't care about the empire anymore. I don't care about the money. I care about the truth. And I'm not going to let anyone stop me from finding it. Emily reached out, placing her hand gently on his arm. We'll do it together, she said softly. We'll face whatever comes next. We're in this together. For a moment, the man in black just stood there, watching them both. There was a long silence before he finally spoke again, his voice low and dangerous. You have no idea what you're getting into. But go ahead. Expose the truth. See what happens when you do. With that, he turned and walked toward the door, disappearing into the darkness of the hallway beyond. Charles and Emily stood there for a moment, the weight of what had just been said hanging in the air. But they weren't scared. They weren't backing down. They had come too far to turn back now. Charles looked at Emily, his eyes filled with determination. We're going to do this, he said. The truth is worth any cost. Emily nodded. Let's make sure it doesn't get buried again. And with that, they walked out of the room, ready to face whatever dangers lay ahead. The truth was in their hands, and they weren't going to let it slip away. Not now. Not ever.